Welcome, everybody, to our second of a three-part series in thinking about how we build community vision, strategic planning, and put those strategies into place. We're very excited to partner with CIE on these webinars as they dive deeply into how they help and support communities to co-design the vision for the future. So my name is Nate McLennan. I am a senior partner at Getting Smart, which is an advisory and advocacy firm for the future of education, and pleased to be joined by a couple other folks who will introduce themselves. So I'll pass it on to Donnie Tran, who will talk about CIE, and then he'll pass it on to the others.
Well, first, thank you, Nate, and thank you to Getting Smart for partnering with us on this. We're so excited. My name is Donnie Tran. I am a partner at the Center for Innovation and Education, CIE, where we try to make systems more responsive to the communities that they are in. And I'll pass it over to my friend Victor.
Hi, everyone. I'm Victor Prusek. I'm the Director of Engagement for the Burlington School District in Burlington, Vermont. We have around 3,400 students spread through pre-K through 12th grade in 12 schools, and have had the pleasure with working with CIE and Donnie over the course of the last 4 years or so. We are entering the fourth year of a strategic plan that they gave us critical help in developing. And I'll pass it on to Melanie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Melanie McGee. I'm Director of the Program Management Office for Bellevue School District in Bellevue, Washington. We have around 19,000 students, and we are in the second year of a strategic planning process. We actually met Donnie and CIE through Victor a couple of years ago when we were looking for a partner to really help us think differently about how we design a strategic plan. So this has been year 2 for us, where we've been diving deeper into defining what our goals and measures will be. Pleased to be here.
Great. Well, welcome, everybody. Grateful that you all could join us today and excited for you all to share some wisdom with our listeners and viewers. So just to give a little context, we want to start by talking about where we headed for. And at Getting Smart, and I think many other of the folks that we partner with around the country, we think about some of these bigger issues and challenges that we're trying to help address to help all learners thrive and reach the goals that they've set for themselves. And so this falls into 4 big categories. So one is broader outcomes. So certainly we have standards, which we call core skills, whether it's an ELA or math, et cetera. But then on top of that, we need to expand and think about durable skills or transferable skills. And so how do we create more broad outcomes and create broader outcomes for young people to strive for? Second is, in order to achieve those outcomes, we need better learner experiences, which have higher engagement and better chance of stronger outcomes for young people. And then the third is, how do we signal to employers or higher education the achievements and the experiences and the competencies that young people have and the learners have gained over their K-12 experience? And then finally, how do we broaden our learner ecosystem so it's not just the school building and within the school walls, but it incorporates all of the learning that can happen in the ecosystem around a learner? So when we think about broader outcomes, better learning experiences, stronger signals, and expanded learning ecosystems, this is the target that we are headed for to help all learners thrive. And so at Getting Smart, we have a larger framework that we think helps unite the field to organize systems change initiatives. And CIE and the work that you all do with partners really fits nicely into this. And so when we think about this frame, we always start with observation and reflection. And then we think about why, what's the community vision, which we talked about in the first webinar with CIE. What are the big outcomes that we expect, whether those are standards or competencies or competency progressions that are associated with the competencies? The how, what does the learning model look like? The signaling, so who is receiving the proxy for completion of competency and completion of standards and learning and understanding? And then finally, the where, the learning ecosystem. Then, of course, we wrap it with how on earth do you share this and scale this so that others can benefit from successful work around the country? So this is the frame that we think about. And today's webinar is going to focus on specifically 2 parts of this. So we're going to review community vision and what we've done before in the first webinar and talk more broadly with a couple great exemplars around the country. And then we're going to dive into a bit of strategy work. Once you have a community vision, what happens? How do you put a strategy into place to make it become a reality? So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Donnie and to get us started on what does this look like in practice.
Thank you so much, Nate. I really appreciate that introduction and the grounding and the idea that we need to think differently about learning. And the learning innovation framework is such a powerful way of doing that. And for us, we also want to ground this in the question of where does legitimacy and accountability really come from? For a long time, we've focused our energy on being compliant with federal requirements. And leadership in the current time really has been focused on answering that question. But in a world of shifting federal roles, leaning on compliance is not a sure path to legitimacy in the eyes of our school leaders, our teachers, our community leaders, and our families. The fact is that because we have to, may not be the end of the conversation anymore. So in order to have real legitimacy and accountability, we have to really lead with the relationships with the people in our community, really understanding what they need, what they care about, and structuring our systems so that we are responsive to that. And we think strategic planning is a key structure and a key lever that can help us do that, can help us forge new relationships that really help us build legitimacy and true accountability with the communities we're meant to serve. And we know that we can really have an impact on trust. At our last webinar, we talked about the declining trust that people have in their institutions and in education systems specifically. What we have found is that our approach to strategic planning can dramatically improve the way that community members feel about the trust they have with their education systems. So this is a bellwether question, and it's framed as a negative, so I'll try to put it in context here. But this key question is, people like me don't have any say about what happens in our schools. So the more people that agree with this, the worse it is. And what we found is in a strategic planning process with our partners in Bellevue, actually, we found that participants in the strategic planning process that we facilitated with them were actually 4 times less likely to agree with this statement compared with the control group. And so we have this signal here, speaking of signals that Nate mentioned, that what we are doing when we go through strategic planning in the way that we're going to talk about during this session, that it has a positive impact on relationships, on responsiveness, and ultimately on trust. And so what are the anchors of this approach? In our last webinar, we talked about the habits of transformative public leadership, and which are really rooted in the idea of inclusion, empathy, co-creation, and reciprocity, which helps us shift from using positional authority as the source of legitimacy towards a legitimacy that's based on relationships, consensus, and trust. If you want to dig into this more, I'd encourage you to go back to the previous webinar where we talk about what each of these things mean in greater detail. But they are the anchor of the way that we think about strategic planning, and which is the process that I'll lay out here. So when we do strategic planning with inclusive design and those 4 habits, we really go through this process that's detailed on this slide. We build a coalition, we listen to the community, we make meaning, we design a strategy that is responsive to what we've learned, and then we empower people to go and do the work. And so we think that this is the relationship building, trust building, inclusive work that should be at the heart of all strategic planning. And we have some evidence and we have a belief that it helps leaders stay in the job long enough to have a meaningful impact on their community and to weather the sort of political storms that are just at the heart of public leadership at this time. In this first phase of doing the work, we really think and focus about how do we build a container that models the kind of democracy that we want to have. What we often end up doing when we compose task forces is we try to put everybody through a single application process. We say, all right, we're going to put this application out into the world, and we want everybody from our community, no matter who they are, where they come from, and what perspectives they bring, we're going to make them apply to be on the strategic planning coalition through this application. And what ends up happening is we actually end up undermining trust, because community members look on this application process and they assume, because of a lot of previous history and bad experiences, that the district is going to choose folks who the superintendent wants and who are just going to say yes to everything and just push through the strategic plan. And so we actually want to acknowledge that there are 3 different types of stakeholders that could be a part of the strategic planning process, and that they should each have their own on-ramp to the coalition. So the first group that I want to talk about is the group we call the essential stakeholders. These are folks who are politically important and have critical expertise. Think about these are the folks who would sit on a blue ribbon commission, that these are your heads of the Chamber of Commerce, these are your board chairs, these are the president of your local union. And what we say for these folks is don't make them apply, just use an invitation from the superintendent to invite them directly. They're just appointed into a third of the seats of your strategic planning coalition. For the interested stakeholders, these are the people who always raise their hands to be a part of committees. These are the people who come to your board meetings. They get all the emails. They're very engaged. They have a lot of social capital and connections and networks. And for these folks, this is a great place to use an application. And so we just say for them, please apply. We'd love for you to be part of it. We hold a third of the seats for this group of interested stakeholders. And then there's this third group, potential stakeholders. These are folks who are in the community, they live the system, they experience the ins and outs of all of our structures, and yet they may not be plugged in to hear about the application. And they are not the kind of folks who usually show up on the radar of the superintendent to be appointed into one of those seats. But they live the system and their insights are critical. And so we use a process of random selection that we also call sortition. That's akin to jury duty. We ask them, we just do a random slice using the data systems of the district, and we invite a random cross-section to join the strategic planning coalition. We don't ask them to apply, we just offer them the seat. So if we think about 30 people as being a part of a coalition, about 10 are directly appointed by the superintendent, 10 come from the application process, and 10 come from the random selection or sortition process. And we think this group, and we're transparent about this, we publish it as a part of the strategic plan. We say this is the 3 different groups that made up the coalition. We think that being clear about that, being honest and transparent, actually is an incredibly big trust building move. And what we end up getting are groups and coalitions that are incredibly well timed to do this work in an inclusive way, because they are inclusive in terms of both race and role and perspective. So this slide shows the composition of the Bellevue Strategic Planning Coalition, which you can see was tremendously diverse in many measures. Melanie, I'm just going to, and Victor, leave a little space here. Is there anything that you wanted to add in terms of composing the coalition?
I think for us here in Bellevue, one thing that was really important is that we gave voice to people who don't always feel access to some of our traditional ways of including them. And so that third group that you talked about, the potential group, those who we went out and sortitioned or tapped on the shoulder, it was really important for us to actually be able to get this composition of our coalition by race and by role. And we worked hard to elevate voices who don't always participate. And that was super powerful for us.
I would add to that, I would echo that. For us, we were using the phrase radical inclusion. And so we were really thinking about what does our district look like, number one, as far as composition by race and income, students receiving services through special education or multilingual services. But we were also thinking about in a radical inclusion model, often those folks were left out of that process. Just including them is not enough. And if they're not included in decent numbers, they're not feeling like they can necessarily participate. And so trying to almost overrepresent certain folks as a way to create a coalition where people would, in fact, freely participate and engage.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much, both of you, trying to avoid the tokenism trap, where we have a sort of token representation, but to have large enough numbers of people that Melanie noted represent voices that usually aren't at the table and who really should be if we're going to design a system that really meets all needs. So once you have this group, what do you do? One of the things that we think is really important is that we all need to get on the same page about what the strategic plan is supposed to do. And this process is what we call building a shared reality. We all have to ultimately agree that this is the current state of things, and the strategic plan is meant to address that. One of the most important tools that we use are empathy interviews, which those of you who are fans of the design thinking process are probably very familiar with. We use questions, and we empower the members of the coalition to use questions like, can you describe a time when you were really struggling with something with the school, but it worked out in the end? How did you get through it? And so it's inviting people to tell a story about the ways in which they experienced the system in the past, so that we can draw out themes about where the system is working for people, where it's not working for people. And we empower each member of the coalition to go out and do a whole host of these types of interviews. And then we bring that data back in to the coalition at a follow-up meeting. And what do we do at that meeting? As the next part of establishing a shared reality or building a shared reality, we use these empathy interview data to help us develop what we call problem statements. These are tools, a statement that capture the most important themes from the interviews. What you can see here is that each of these statements has a user and a need, but a problem that gets in the way of that need being met. So you can see here that students in red in the bottom right corner, students and teachers want a supportive environment that understands and empowers them. However, there's a gap between what our BSD community culture is and what it needs to be. And so that's an articulation of one of the core needs that people are feeling, what they want, but what is the challenge that's sort of in the way. We start with multiple problem statements as people are working in small groups to process their empathy interview data, but we support coalitions to forge a single problem statement. So you can see here that the single problem statement identified in the Bellevue strategic plan is that each member of the diverse BSD community wants to feel heard, valued, and affirmed so that they can feel empowered to do their best work. But there's not yet an organizational culture that helps each individual experience a sense of belonging and support. And so that becomes the center of the strategic plan. The strategic plan, in some sense, is trying to answer or respond to this problem statement. But we need to focus our attention on that problem statement, but we do need to understand the many causes for why the problem statement exists. So we lead districts in the coalition in a process of engaging in root cause analysis so that we can name the issues in a way that actually may be counterintuitive. Naming the issues doesn't actually make us look weak. It actually makes us look honest, which enhances trust. Sometimes we've had the experience of people saying, wow, I'm just really glad people are saying this finally, which actually lends legitimacy to the project, not taking away from it.
I'll just say for us, this was really hard. One, to see and to hear. We know it's true, but it takes a lot of courage to put these words up on a screen and share them back out with folks. And we had leaders who were hesitant to do it. Donnie probably remembers, we said, do we really? You don't call it a problem statement. Maybe we call it an opportunity. And you said, no, it's actually really important to name it as the challenge that it is. And you're absolutely right that in doing so, people in the room were so appreciative that we called it out. Naming it gave us a focus, and it gave us something to then think about where we go next and how we want to begin to tackle it.
These were so powerful that recently, in the last actually couple of weeks, a group of us went back to them because we have all these archived to go back to that more raw data to look at what, in the words of the people who are participating in this work of the original guiding coalition, what were they saying those problems were? Because we're now entering year 4 and we're sort of building the activities that we're going to be focusing on in our different priority areas next year. And we wondered if we were drifting too far from the original intent, because a refined strategic plan can only say so much. And this is sort of all the behind the scenes data. So we actually have gone back to that data. So that's how powerful that is.
Once you've sort of gotten to this place where you're named the problems, which We don't want to admire issues and problems. We want to ground in them so that we can have a shared reality for moving forward. And so we go from building a shared reality into the next step of our strategic planning process, where we generate what we call community commitments, what it will look, feel, and sound like to our community when we've solved the problem statement. And this is where we turn from understanding the problem to aspiring to something different. These commitments lay the groundwork for how the community will gauge ongoing progress and success. So what you can see here is the community commitments from Bellevue's strategic plan were rooted in three big overarching umbrella ideas. We belong, we learn, we lead. And on the right side, we describe like what we and members of the community would really experience if we achieve these aspirations: belonging, learning, leadership. So after establishing a shared understanding of the present and a shared vision of the future, really then shifting into the idea of identifying priority areas and strategies that will address the problem statement and move towards the community commitments is, as much as anything in a strategic planning process that's really community rooted, is kind of straightforward. You're identifying a few things that are going to help you make progress towards belonging, learning, and leadership in the context of Bellevue. And that can really be galvanizing. It's very focusing. So once you have priority areas like the ones shown here from Burlington, we think that everybody in every district and every leader has a responsibility to communicate with the community about the progress that's being made over time. And so you can see here the 5 priority areas identified through the strategic planning process in Burlington. And this one slide that captures one way in which the leadership of Burlington communicates about how the strategic plan is being implemented and the progress and ongoing needs really are playing out.
One of the big pieces of this was this commitment to accountability. And so it's interesting, there was a slide earlier about sort of the change in accountability, especially in this day and age, from, if you think about the Department of Education, but also for our own agency of education at the state level. We want there to be accountability, but the accountability we want to be to our community. So our teachers, our students, our families, that's what we want, and to each other at the district level, that level of accountability. And so this is one way to do that. It was definitely a difficult process to land on metrics that were measurable and also could make sense to most of those constituents who I mentioned, but also could be reported in a way that if you don't want to dig deep into data, you could sort of see. And so we've landed on this visual representation. I have a colleague, Karen Vogel, who loves to come up with different ways that one can illustrate changes in progress when we're thinking about educational data that's visual, so visual representations. And so this is one that she came up with. The lovely piece of this is we are truly seeing progress over time. There are some occasional dips. We launched our plan during COVID, so you can imagine like what year one was and was year one even reliable. But we are really seeing progress right now. And it's warts and all, right? There's some places where we maybe are declining or we're just staying flat, but we're being honest about that. And that helps us think about how do we want to use our resources, time and money moving forward each year.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. This is a really, every time I look at this report, I always think of how elegant it is, honest it is, and how understandable it is. And so thank you for showing us a little bit about how Burlington is approaching that. Now, just considering what we've talked about so far, the idea of assembling a diverse coalition, establishing a shared reality through empathy interviews, problem statements and root causes, and building a vision for the future through community commitments, and then reporting out about progress through tools just like Victor just shared. All of these parts of the process have all been working towards the goal of building legitimacy that is based in relationships, not compliance. And so we wanted to offer up this video of a student as we close here, who is sharing her priority area with the board on the night of the presentation of the strategic plan and its ultimate approval.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Preeti Mangar, and I'm in 11th grade attending Burlington High School. My family immigrated from Nepal to the United States when I was in 2nd grade. Going to a new school, speaking a different language, and taking in a new environment is a lot for a child. Many children in the Burlington district have experienced or are experiencing those overwhelming emotions. Wanting to be included in the community is a longing of not only immigrant students, but every individual. The coalition group has recognized priority area number 1 to be focused on belonging and well-being. For the metrics, we will know we succeeded in the area when we see that 90% of students and staff say that they belong and their well-being is supported at their school. When there was a decrease in disparity between students on IEPs and not. When there is an increase in the percentage of families that they feel they belong in our district. The metrics should demonstrate reduced chronic absenteeism for students who qualify for free and reduced lunch.
So we wanted to show that in order to illustrate that much of leadership right now can feel disconnected from the student experience and from the experience of families and educators. And that by structuring a strategic planning process in a way that intentionally includes those voices, empathizes with them, co-creates with them, and is ultimately in a reciprocal relationship with them is, we think, a key element of building lasting legacy, impact, and legitimacy in our work.
Donnie, Melanie, and Victor, thank you so much. That was really informative. It really helps, I think, our listeners and viewers really think about these big picture ideas. Is that the first webinar addressed community vision? How do you build coalitions and co-design? How do you then, in this webinar, put it together in a strategy? And how do you record progress on that strategy and have all the stakeholders involved? And then looking forward to our third webinar, which is going to be about implementation. So really appreciate the time and energy put into this work. It makes a difference for the students in both school districts that we talked to today, and the process itself is going to be really helpful for the folks that watch this video. If you need more information, please connect with us at Getting Smart at jessica@gettingsmart.com and CIE at contact@leadingwithlearning.org. And we look forward to seeing everybody in the next webinar.